Hello and welcome back to London Cycle Routes. Today I'll be showing you how to cycle from Greenwich in southeast London all the way over to Woolwich. This ride takes a little under 30 minutes and you can do the whole thing on quiet streets and protected cycle lanes. By public transport, the same journey takes more like 40 minutes, so you can definitely save time by getting on your bike. If you find this video useful or you just enjoy watching it, then don't forget to hit subscribe on the channel, as I try to post new videos just like it every week. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon. If you'd like to contribute as well, then you can find a link in the description below the video. Alright, let's get going. So we're starting by the Cutty Sark, an old tea clipper that is open to the public and well worth a visit, and we're going to head right through the old Royal Naval College. This street is probably the most pleasant way to get to the other side of the college, but it actually shuts at night. The gates are closed, so if you do need to come here at night, you can actually use the path along the Thames. I wouldn't recommend going that way during the day, as it does get quite busy with visitors and tourists and it's quite narrow, but at night when there are fewer people and the college is closed, it shouldn't really be an issue, and it's certainly the best option available at that time. The college itself is well worth a visit if you're interested in the maritime history of Greenwich, especially the painted hall, which is basically a big grand hall with a very impressive painted ceiling that some say rivals the Sistine Chapel. You'll have to make up your own mind on that one, but I can tell you for sure that it is very cool. For the next part of this ride, we're going to be cycling on this quiet back street, which is actually the old Woolwich Road. Despite being a back street, it is very direct and very convenient, and it is also completely free of through motor traffic thanks to this bollard here, which effectively closes the road to cars but allows us to cycle through it. You can see that there are plenty of people riding around on bikes here, even in the middle of the day on a weekday. Greenwich Council does have plans to put protected cycle lanes down the main road all the way into Greenwich Town Centre as part of the Cycleway 4 scheme, but they're not in yet. For now, this is a perfectly good alternative, especially if you're starting at the Cutty Sark. Talking of Cycleway 4, we're now joining that protected lane, and this section of it has been built, and very nice it is too. This is a two-way protected cycle track, and it actually runs all the way up to New Charlton. When the full route is done, you should be able to cycle all the way from Woolwich to London Bridge on a protected cycle lane on the main roads just like this. However, that isn't the case at the moment, but it doesn't matter for us, as I'm going to show you how to bypass the gaps and use quiet back streets to get where we need to go without worrying too much about any traffic. Now, as I said, this lane continues all the way up to Charlton, but we're actually going to turn off at Armitage Road. Don't miss that turning. Armitage Road is effectively a cul-de-sac, so there isn't any traffic on it and it's really nice and quiet. But importantly for us, it actually connects us to a really nice quiet cycle route, which is going to take us all the way to the River Thames. This short section of the route is a little bit twisty and has a number of different turns, which it is easy to miss. You can see the wayfinding on the ground. There was an arrow pointing us down this route, but if you need a bit of extra help, don't forget that you can always download a map of the route in the description below the video. It comes in a GPX file and you can use it on whatever app or device you choose to use. It is a standard format. Now, the next section of this route is quite interesting. We're actually going to be going on this huge bridge over the Blackwall Tunnel approach road. You are allowed to cycle on this, and you can see it's got not particularly steep ramps to aid you sort of going up here, so you don't have to dismount, and it is relatively wide at most of its points, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Do remember though that it is shared with pedestrians, and particularly at the pinch points like here, you should be really courteous, and if you see anybody here, let them pass, although there isn't that much in the way of foot traffic. I do have mixed feelings about this bridge, because on the one hand it's great to be able to cross the road, on the other hand it's kind of sad to have such a big road here at all in London. It causes a lot of severance in the area and makes it harder to get around by foot. I quite like these parallel crossings here, but what I don't like is the signposts and bollards in the cycle lane here, which actually take up pretty much half the width of the lane. So if you see anybody coming in the opposite direction, make sure you give way to them. There is a cycle crossing here which is operated by a push button, and then there are more protected cycle lanes running up Southern Way. Although it's not immediately obvious, this is actually a two-way cycle track. The markings have mostly faded off, but there are cycle symbols at each end pointing in opposite directions, which indicates a two-way track. Now, there's a very irritating situation coming up. Note the blue shared space sign on the right and on the floor, but then also these signs on the lampposts which appear to indicate no cycling. It's a bike with a red line going through it. Now, obviously, these two signs conflict. One says it's a cycle route and one says it's not. Although only the shared space sign is actually a legal traffic sign, as a no cycling sign should just be a bike in a red circle. You can dismount and walk your bike here if you like, although given the shared space signs, I felt comfortable cycling through there, of course being courteous and considerate to any pedestrians that we would have encountered. There weren't any this time. I did a bit of research and it turns out that Southern Park is actually not managed by the local council but by a separate private organisation, and I think this issue is a good example of why that isn't a particularly good idea. Obviously the conflicting and non-standard signage is a bit amateurish, but there's also the wider problem that this route is actually a designated cycle route we're going down. It was part of the London Cycle Network, and the organisation that manages the park is either unaware or doesn't care that it is a designated route, and so has tried to prohibit cycling, albeit a bit ham-fistedly, on part of that route. Now, local councils can be bad as well, certainly, but I do think were it a local authority managed park, you'd probably get a bit more joined up thinking, and they would check to see whether there was a cycle route agreed to run through the park or not, and maybe consult with other stakeholders before doing something like that. Anyway, enough of that. We have found ourselves on the Thames Path and it's looking very industrial. If you look above us, you'll see those conveyor belts. They're actually for moving what's called aggregate, so things like sand, gravel, etc. from one yard to the other, which also explains why underneath them there's quite a lot of sand on the path, as they do seem to spill quite a lot over the edge. Maybe I would think differently if I was cycling through here when it was wet, but I actually don't mind because I think they look really cool above us and they're quite fun to look at. London doesn't have huge amounts of industry, it's really a service economy, so it's just kind of interesting to cycle through somewhere with a lot of heavy industry. Now, I was initially annoyed at this van blocking the path until I realised that it was actually stopping us riding right into this chainsaw crew which was trimming the vegetation on the path, so I can definitely let that slide and I totally understand why they parked there. Trimming the vegetation is something that really needs to be done. You can see right up here. I hope that they got to that after I cycled past. It's of course really pleasant to have a bit of greenery around cycle routes, but it's equally important to make sure that the greenery doesn't get too overgrown. At the very least, it can narrow the path if things get too overgrown, or at the very worst, it can actually be quite dangerous and do things like block line of sight. So it's great to see those guys out there trimming it back, and I hope that they got to this bit as well. Now, I've just stopped to take a little look at the Thames Barrier. That is an incredibly cool structure in my view. It looks really, really high tech, and it was actually designed in the 1970s, so I can only imagine how people thought it looked then. It must have looked like something from another planet. Perhaps there are some viewers who remember. It's also incredibly important as a piece of infrastructure. It was built to prevent flooding in London. Flooding has been a problem in this city for, a couple of thousand years pretty much, since the Romans built it here on a river estuary. And in the spring, when there's a strong spring tide, you occasionally get a storm surge which basically deluges the whole city. And that barrier can be raised and prevent flooding, and it works really, really well. We haven't had that much in the way of river flooding through here since it was built. It was commissioned by the Greater London Council, which was the old sort of quite powerful local government in London in the 1970s, and it was completed in the 1980s. The stats are interesting. When the barrier was designed, they only expected to have to raise it between 2 and 3 times a year, but it's actually averaged between 6 and 7 times a year. And that average has been significantly dragged up by the years 2013 to 2014, in which the barrier had to be closed a total of 50 times. So it's significantly more useful than they expected it to be. I'd also add that it is just a good thing that the GLC got it built in the 70s, because I'm not sure with the UK's checkered history of delivering infrastructure projects recently, it would necessarily even get built today if it hadn't been done in the 20th century. Maybe it would have, but I think it probably would have been a bit more of a struggle, certainly. Now, this section of the Thames Path is really quite nice. There's obviously a separate section for cyclists on the right and pedestrians on the left. Do watch out though where the path crosses these entrances to apartment buildings. You can see by the tactile paving in front of the gaps. There's another one just here with the give-way lines. People may emerge without warning from these gaps in the hedge, and there's obviously quite low visibility there, so it's a good reason not to ride too quickly down there, or at least to keep your wits about you as you do. You don't want, a kid to run out and you accidentally hit them or something like that. Another thing that I would say is that you may not be able to tell this from the video, but the surface on the green path is of variable quality. Some bits are quite good, but other bits are verging on rocky. So yeah, do make sure you've got some good tyres if you cycle down here, as it's not always the smoothest of tarmac. This section here does turn into shared space, and there's a bit of a blind corner behind those plants, and it does get really narrow here too, so obviously be courteous and aware of anyone who's walking down there, especially around the corners, and just make sure you give priority to pedestrians as you go down here. You are allowed to cycle down here. It is a shared space, of course. Interestingly, this section that we're passing through now, just before Woolwich Ferry, was actually closed for a very long time to allow for the development of these towers on the right here. That's one reason that I haven't done this video earlier, as I couldn't make it down here to do them. There was a very unsatisfactory diversion on the main road. What is more interesting and quite funny is that the developer that was working on those towers has finally finished them after a significant delay, but has actually been ordered by the local council to demolish them. You might have seen that story on the news. What happened there was that the council says that the developer built the towers very differently to the ones which were approved in planning permission. So they used different materials, smaller windows, smaller balconies. Some of the flats that were supposed to be wheelchair accessible were not wheelchair accessible. And the council said, well, this is so different to what was approved that you're going to have to demolish it, I'm afraid. The developer, I think, is going to appeal that, so it remains to be seen whether or not that happens. But anyway, we are back on the Thames Path, and this bit is very good and weirdly changes colour into red, which I think is actually probably a nicer surface for a cycle path. It's similar to the colour that's used on paths in the Netherlands, I think, which is obviously a country with a great cycling history. It's a little bit odd that it switches from red to green and then back to red, and it's actually going to switch back to green in a second again. Maybe they should make up their mind on which one to use. I guess that's a bit of a microcosm of cycle paths in London, as they do tend to have pretty inconsistent colours. You now find yourself on Number 1 Street in Woolwich, which is kind of the central pedestrianised boulevard of the redeveloped Woolwich Arsenal. This was a military establishment used for making armaments from the 17th century until 1994, and since then it's been redeveloped into a mixed-use development with lots of homes, and there are some pubs and shops and such as well. I think they've done a reasonable job of making it quite nice and preserving quite a lot of the historic buildings as well. That pub on the left there is alright, as is the one on the right there in that kind of Georgian looking house. It is a bit grey today, but when it's sunny, it is a nice place to come and sit out, I think. We're also pretty close to the Woolwich Elizabeth line station. Now, I'm going to dismount here and use this pedestrian crossing, just walk over it into Beresford Square, which is right in the centre of Woolwich. So we are here. Thanks so much for watching that, guys. Let me know in the comments what you think of that route. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed the video, and once again a huge thank you to everyone who is on the Patreon. If you'd like to contribute as well, you can always find a link in the description below the video where you can chuck us a couple of quid a month. And yeah, make sure you like the video and leave a comment, as it does help other people find it. And yeah, I'll see you guys again next time.